The United States government made over 600 documented attempts to kill one man. Not 6, not 60. Over 600 attempts spread across a decade, 3 presidencies, and at least 5 CIA directors, all directed at a single human being who lived on an island 90 miles from the Florida coast. And for 30 years, the men who ran these programs lied to Congress about every single one of them. 600 attempts, they failed every time. Not for lack of resources, not for lack of authorization, not for lack of the most sophisticated scientific and operational capabilities the most powerful intelligence apparatus in the world could bring to bear. They failed because the man they were trying to kill was better protected than they understood, and because the people they hired to do it were using the relationship for purposes that had nothing to do with killing him. What they did not fail at was hiding it. Senior CIA officers withheld evidence from the commission investigating a presidential assassination. They destroyed files under the direct threat of congressional inquiry. They coordinated their testimony so carefully across so many years that the full architecture of what they had built and operated did not surface until a Senate committee with subpoena power and the rare political will to use it finally pulled the thread in 1975. By that point, the men who designed the program had retired. They had received government medals and commendations. Some of them had written memoirs. None of them, not one, had ever been charged with a crime related to any of it. The target was Fidel Castro. The program, the first formally approved, formally budgeted, formally staffed assassination initiative in the Central Intelligence Agency's institutional history, was codenamed ZR Rifle. And alongside it ran a companion operation of such brazen institutional criminality that its full disclosure, when it finally came, produced one of the most damaging and consequential congressional reports in the history of American oversight. The CIA hired the American Mafia to kill a foreign head of state. They sat in hotel rooms in Miami Beach with men who ran gambling rackets, narcotics routes, and body disposal operations as professional matters, and they offered those men poison pills and payment and operational guidance, and they framed the geopolitical necessity of murder with the same neutral bureaucratic language they might use for a procurement contract. Chicago outfit boss Sam Giancana, who was under active FBI surveillance at the very time this happened, attended planning meetings with CIA officers. Santos Trafficante Jr., who had operated criminal enterprises in Havana until Fidel Castro's revolution shut them down, became a contracted asset. Johnny Rosselli, a man J. Edgar Hoover's bureau had tracked for decades as a senior figure in the American underworld, a man the FBI was actively trying to prosecute, became the CIA's primary liaison between the agency and organized crime. When the Church Committee uncovered this arrangement in 1975, the phrase that appeared again and again in witness testimony was plausible deniability. The idea, formalized in the Eisenhower administration's National Security Council structure and woven into the operational doctrine of American covert action, that a president could authorize programs without creating a documentary trail that would survive political exposure. Plausible deniability required that the officers carrying out operations understand they would never be officially acknowledged, never be publicly defended, and if exposed, never be claimed. The system is designed for betrayal. The men inside it understand this and sign on anyway. Some of them spend the next 15 years lying to Congress about what they did. When I first read the CIA Inspector General's 1967 internal review of this program, the document the agency wrote about its own conduct, which was classified for an additional 26 years before finally surfacing through a Freedom of Information Act request in 1993, I had to set it down. Not because of any single disclosure, because of the register. The clinical administrative precision of a government bureaucracy describing the operational architecture of a murder contract produces a specific kind of unease that is different from anything else in the declassified record. There is no anguish in it. There is no hesitation. There are case numbers and operational timelines and delivery mechanisms and budget lines. These were not rogue officers acting outside a system. This was the system in writing with approval signatures. This video is about what they did, who authorized it, what they destroyed when the exposure became likely, and what it tells us about a government that answered to no one for a decade and faced no meaningful legal consequences for any of it. Before we get into it, hit subscribe and drop a like. The algorithm actively buries this kind of content. It begins not with a plot but with a panic. January 1st, 1959. A dictator boards a plane before sunrise and disappears, and in Langley, Virginia, the most powerful intelligence apparatus in the world realizes it has spent years watching the wrong outcome. Event 1, the fall of BATISTA, the CIA's immediate panic, 1959. On the evening of December 31st, 1958, Fulgencio Batista is hosting a New Year's party at his presidential palace in Havana. The music is playing, the champagne is poured. At 2 a.m. on January 1st, 1959, Batista boards a waiting aircraft for the Dominican Republic, taking with him an estimated $300 million in government funds and the small circle of men who have enriched themselves most thoroughly under his regime. He issues no public statement. He does not address the country. He simply disappears into the Caribbean night while the party is still going. The news reaches the streets of Havana before sunrise. The reaction is immediate and overwhelming. The revolutionary forces begin moving toward the capital. Fidel Castro, commanding from the eastern end of the island, orders a general advance. On January 2nd, his forces reach Santiago de Cuba. The military commander there, General Eulogio Cantillo, had briefly attempted to arrange an interim junta, but the move collapses within hours. The army, demoralized and leaderless, does not resist. The revolution's geography moves westward across the island at a pace that surprises even those who had believed in it. Castro enters Havana on January 8, 1959. He is 32 years old. He has been in the Sierra Maestra Mountains for nearly 3 years, surviving air attacks, government offensives, the capture and execution of most of his original comrades from the Granma landing, and at least one ambush that came close enough to his position that his survival afterward struck even his supporters as implausible. He is alive. He rides a convoy of military vehicles through a city that erupts along every block of the route. The crowd estimates in contemporaneous journalism range from 80,000 to over 100,000 people lining the avenues. Castro speaks from a balcony at the former presidential palace for more than 2 hours. His beard is unshaved. His fatigues are the same ones he wore in the mountains. He has won. In Washington, the response is not jubilant. The CIA's Western Hemisphere Division under J.C. King has monitored the guerrilla campaign in the Sierra Maestra since its early stages. The agency's intelligence assessments from 1957 and 1958, several of which survive in declassified form in the National Security Archive, describe Castro's forces as a manageable insurgency that the Batista government, with continued American military aid, will eventually suppress. The failure is not one of raw intelligence collection. The failure is one of institutional certainty. Men who have decided what the outcome will be interpret available evidence in ways that confirm the predetermined conclusion. The agency that prides itself on knowing what foreign governments will do before those governments know it watches Cuba fall in 3 years and is caught with no contingency plan. Jim Noel, the CIA station chief in Havana at the time of Castro's arrival, cables Langley with an assessment that describes the new leader as a pragmatic nationalist, possibly drawn toward leftist politics, but potentially manageable if the United States approaches the relationship skillfully. Noel's cable is wrong. This is not because Noel is a poor intelligence officer. It is because Castro has already made decisions that Noel has not yet been able to observe. What Castro has decided, before he enters Havana, is that Cuba's relationship with American corporate capitalism is finished. The Batista years have made Havana into the most profitable gambling and prostitution destination in the Caribbean. American hotel companies, American casino operators, American organized crime, and American corporations in sugar, petroleum, and public utilities have constructed an economic architecture in Cuba that enriches a domestic elite and American investors, while the majority of the Cuban population lives in poverty comparable to the most underdeveloped countries in the hemisphere. Castro is not going to negotiate the terms of that arrangement. He is going to end it. The nationalization of American corporate holdings, United Fruit Company sugar operations, Standard Oil refineries, the Hilton and Riviera hotels, the Havana casinos, is not a possibility he is weighing. It is a commitment already made. The Eisenhower administration moves through stages of response across 1959 and into 1960. First, cautious engagement. Second, concern. Third, as executions of Batista-era military officers proceed through summary tribunals, and as Castro begins the consolidation of state power, a hardening. The United States suspends the Cuban sugar quota in July 1960. The sugar quota is Cuba's economic lifeline. The guaranteed American market for Cuban sugar is what keeps the island's economy viable, and its suspension is an act of economic warfare. By March 1960, well before the sugar quota suspension, President Eisenhower has already approved a covert action program against the Castro government via National Security Council Directive NSC 5412. The phrase used in the directive is "by any means necessary." The specific document that opens the Assassination chapter is a memorandum from J.C. King to CIA Director Allen Dulles, dated December 11, 1959. The Church Committee recovers this memo and enters it into the public record. King does not use the word assassination. He uses eliminate. He recommends that the CIA give serious consideration to the elimination of Fidel Castro, arguing that his continued leadership of Cuba poses an unacceptable geopolitical risk to American interests throughout the Western Hemisphere, and that without Castro, the revolutionary government would likely collapse into factionalism. The memo asks a question. Dulles does not reject it. Within 3 months, the CIA's clandestine services are discussing the operational requirements of political assassination at the level of deputy directors. The memo that begins it all is filed in a bureaucratic outbox in Washington. The man who receives it decides not to say no. The machinery begins its turn, and what it builds over the next 5 years is the most thoroughly documented assassination program in American intelligence history, documented because, despite the best efforts of the men who ran it to destroy the evidence, enough of the record survived to tell the story. What makes the Eisenhower administration's response to Cuba structurally distinct from previous episodes of American covert action is the degree to which it formalizes the decision-making architecture for illegal operations. The NSC 5412 framework, the policy document that authorizes covert action against Cuba, is part of a broader set of directives that reorganize how the executive branch manages sensitive operations. A special group of senior NSC officials is created specifically to oversee covert actions, providing a layer of interagency review that gives the operations bureaucratic legitimacy without creating the kind of explicit presidential record that formal legal authorization would produce. This is the system working as designed. The system is designed to enable things that cannot be officially endorsed. Event 2, ZR Rifle, the CIA's first formal assassination program, 1960. The program has a name before it has a target. This is the detail that matters more than almost any other in the entire story. ZR Rifle is not an emergency response to Fidel Castro. It is not created because one specific man represents one specific threat that requires one specific solution. It is created as standing infrastructure, a permanent capability within the CIA's clandestine services for carrying out what the agency's internal documents refer to. In the language the Church Committee's investigators recover and enter into the public record as executive action. Executive action is the CIA's institutional euphemism for political assassination. The decision to build ZR Rifle as a standing, funded, permanently staffed program, rather than an ad hoc operational response to a specific threat, reflects a philosophical decision about what kind of institution the CIA should be. The agency is deciding in the late 1950s that assassination is a permanent tool of American statecraft that should be maintained and ready. This decision is made not by rogue officers in a back room. It is made at the highest levels of the CIA's leadership with the knowledge and implicit authorization of the executive branch. The officer assigned to build and run ZR Rifle is William King Harvey. He is 42 years old in 1960, heavyset and physically imposing, a former FBI agent who left the Bureau under circumstances that the surviving personnel records do not entirely clarify. There are indications in both FBI and CIA documentation that his departure from the FBI involved pressure rather than choice, and who joined the CIA in 1947 during its earliest organizational period. Harvey's career within the CIA has been operationally distinguished. He is the officer who identifies and exposes Kim Philby as a Soviet penetration agent within British intelligence, one of the most consequential counterintelligence coups of the Cold War. He runs the Berlin Tunnel operation in 1954, in which the CIA digs a quarter-mile tunnel under the Soviet sector of East Berlin to tap military communications cables. The operation runs for nearly a year before the Soviets expose it, and although it later emerges that the Soviets knew about the tunnel before it was completed, because George Blake, a CIA officer in on the planning, was a Soviet asset, the operation demonstrates the kind of audacious operational thinking that defines Harvey's career. Harvey carries a loaded pistol to internal CIA meetings in Langley, Virginia, not as a protest or an affectation, as a practice. His colleagues testify before the church committee that this was simply how he operated. He drinks with consistency. He speaks with indirectness that CIA culture, which prizes circumlocution and euphemism, finds genuinely unsettling. He is, by the accounts of people who work with him, one of the most effective clandestine officers the agency has produced. He is also not a person who spends time asking whether the things he is doing are right. Harvey's primary operational asset within ZR Rifle's early development is known to the CIA by the cryptonym QJWIN. The Church Committee investigators determined that QJWIN is a European national with a documented criminal background, recruited specifically because of his connections to criminal networks and his demonstrated willingness to do things that CIA officers cannot officially sanction. QJWIN's role within ZR Rifle is not as a direct operative, but as a talent identifier, the man who finds people willing to kill and routes them into the operational structure through layers of cutouts designed to prevent any documentary trail from leading back to the agency. He is, in the language of the program, the interface between the CIA's resources and the criminal capacity to use them. The formal authorization for the broader Cuba Covert Action Program, which ZR Rifle becomes a component of, comes from the Eisenhower NSC via Directive NSC 5412 in early 1960. The specific operational mechanism relies on the concept of plausible deniability, a doctrine formally developed within the NSC structure by advisors including Gordon Gray, Eisenhower's national security advisor, and elaborated in NSC working papers from this period. Under plausible deniability, the President receives notification that a capability exists and is being considered for use, without being briefed on operational specifics. This means the President can credibly deny giving explicit orders. The system is designed not for security but for protection, the protection of political leadership from the accountability that would attach to explicit authorization of illegal acts. It formalizes dishonesty as operating doctrine at the highest level of the United States government. Richard Bissell, the CIA's Deputy Director for Plans, takes personal ownership of the ZR Rifle program and its application to Castro. Bissell is 42 years old in 1960, Yale-educated, economically trained, a man who rose through the post-war intelligence hierarchy on the strength of his strategic vision and his ability to manage large, complex covert operations. He is the father of the U-2 reconnaissance aircraft program, one of the most significant intelligence collection achievements of the Cold War. He will later be the architect of the Bay of Pigs invasion, one of the most significant intelligence failures. He is, by the assessment of his own subsequent congressional testimony, fully aware that ZR Rifle is a program for political assassination and that he is authorizing its deployment against a foreign head of state. He makes this authorization with the understanding that the President has sanctioned the removal of Castro from power, and that removal means what it says. The CIA Inspector General's 1967 report, which describes the ZR Rifle program with the neutral language of an institution managing its own liability, acknowledges in its careful phrasing that ZR Rifle represented a fundamental shift in CIA doctrine. The report's description of the program as involving executive action capabilities against Cuban leadership is the most candid the agency's official record gets about what the program was. Richard Bissell retires from the CIA in February 1962 in the aftermath of the Bay of Pigs failure. He receives the National Intelligence Medal at a private ceremony attended by agency leadership. He is subsequently appointed president of the Institute for Defense Analyses. He gives interviews late in his life and acknowledges, with the measured candor of a man whose legal exposure has long since expired, that ZR rifle was what the church committee said it was. He expresses no apparent remorse. He dies in February 1994 in Farmington, Connecticut. He is never charged with anything related to ZR rifle or the Castro assassination program. The CIA culture that makes ZR rifle possible is worth understanding on its own terms, because dismissing it as simply criminal misses its internal coherence. The men who build and run the program are, by the standards of their profession and their era, doing what professionals do, analyzing a problem, assessing available tools, and applying them. The Cold War framework within which they operate treats the Soviet threat as existential. A communist Cuba in this framework is a Soviet base 90 miles from American territory, a forward position for operations against the American mainland, a template for communist revolution throughout Latin America. The men who build ZR rifle are not psychopaths. They are men whose moral imagination has been compressed by ideology into a framework where the ends genuinely justify the means, and where the moral costs of the means are not invisible but are assessed and accepted as operational overhead. This is not an excuse. It is an explanation of how institutional evil works, not as aberration, but as conclusion. Event 3, the Mob Contract, ROSSELLI, GINCNA, and TRAFFICNT, 1960. The meeting takes place at the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami Beach, sometime in September 1960. The Fontainebleau is the flagship hotel of its era on the Florida coast, a 14-story curved tower of white concrete and glass on the ocean front, a place that represents a specific kind of American mid-century glamour, the kind that costs money and doesn't apologize for it. It is an interesting location for a meeting at which a representative of the United States government will offer organized crime figures a contract to kill a foreign head of state. It is, in retrospect, exactly the right location. It signals the register these men inhabit. The Fontainebleau is not aspirational for them. It is simply the kind of room where business happens. The CIA representative at the table is Robert Maheu. Maheu is 50 years old in 1960. He is a former FBI special agent who now operates as a private investigative contractor, and his specific professional value is precisely what this situation requires. He has a documented track record of conducting sensitive operations on behalf of institutional clients in ways that preserve the client's deniability. He currently works for Howard Hughes, among other clients, managing Hughes's interests in ways that require a certain operational flexibility. He is the cutout, the man between the CIA and what is about to happen, whose role is to ensure that if the arrangement ever surfaces publicly, it surfaces at him and stops there. Maheu has already been in contact with Johnny Rosselli before the Fontainebleau meeting. Rosselli is 53 years old, born in Asperia, Italy as Filippo Sacco, and has spent 3 decades assembling one of the most extensive personal networks in American organized crime. He operates in the world of the Chicago outfit, managing that organization's interests in Las Vegas, including casino operations at properties where legitimate entertainment figures mingle casually with men who are, professionally, criminals. He has relationships with criminal enterprises across the country and in Cuba and the Caribbean. He is, within his world, the person you call when you need an introduction that cannot happen through official channels. The introductions he makes are to 2 specific people. Santos Trafficante Jr. is 46 years old in September 1960. His father, Santos Trafficante Sr., built a criminal organization in Tampa, Florida, beginning in the early 20th century, and when the elder Trafficante died in 1954, his son inherited both the enterprise and the relationships. The younger Trafficante has expanded significantly into Cuba, where the Batista regime's tolerance for organized crime allowed him to operate gambling, prostitution, and narcotics distribution networks in Havana. Castro's revolution has cost him an income stream worth millions annually and has put him briefly in a Cuban prison. Castro's government arrested several mob figures in the early months of 1959, holding them for a period before allowing them to leave the country. Trafficante has personal financial grievances against the Castro government that the CIA believes constitute a reliable operational motive. Sam Giancana is 52 years old in September 1960. He is the boss of the Chicago outfit, the direct institutional successor to the criminal organization built by Al Capone in the 1920s, which by 1960 has evolved into a sophisticated enterprise with interests in casino gambling, labor union racketeering, narcotics distribution, and enforcement operations across Illinois and beyond. Giancana is, at the moment of the Fontainebleau meeting, under active FBI surveillance. The Chicago field office has been monitoring his communications and movements for years. J. Edgar Hoover's bureau has spent significant resources trying to build a prosecution that will put Giancana in federal prison. He sits down with a CIA intermediary in a Miami Beach hotel and discusses the logistics of murdering a foreign head of state on behalf of the United States government. The CIA's initial offer is $150,000 for the successful killing of Castro. This figure appears in Maheu's Church Committee testimony and is confirmed in the CIA Inspector General's report. The mob figures decline the payment. This decision is neither altruistic nor ideological. Accepting documented payment creates paper trail. It also reframes the legal situation. If the operation fails and surfaces, declining payment allows these men to characterize their participation as voluntary service to their country rather than a murder contract, which is a meaningfully different position in any subsequent proceeding. The CIA records describe the declination without interpretive comment and note that it does not affect the operational parameters of the arrangement. What the CIA provides instead is the weapon itself. The Technical Services Division produces botulinum toxin capsules, pills engineered to dissolve in liquid without producing odor, discoloration, or detectable taste, delivering a lethal dose calibrated to produce a death that would be difficult to distinguish from natural causes in a standard post-mortem examination without specific toxicological screening. The pills are transferred to the operational chain. The plan is to route them through a Cuban agent with direct access to Castro's food or drink. Sheffield Edwards is the CIA officer managing the agency's side of the relationship. Edwards is the CIA's director of security, technically the officer responsible for the protection of CIA personnel, facilities, and classified information. He is now running a murder contract through organized crime figures. Edwards briefs Richard Bissell on the arrangement in full. His disclosure to CIA Director Alan Dulles is, based on the surviving record, partial at best, a pattern of briefing that protects Dulles' plausible deniability while ensuring the operational leadership knows what is happening. The first poison delivery runs through Juan Orta, a Cuban finance ministry official who has been recruited as a CIA asset and who has previously had access to Castro's personal schedule. Orta receives the botulinum capsules and is tasked with introducing them at a Havana restaurant where Castro is known to eat. The attempt fails before it progresses to execution. Cuban intelligence records later confirm that by the time Orta receives the pills, Castro's security services have already been alerted, through channels the CIA cannot account for in its surviving records, to the possibility of a poisoning attempt. Castro's schedule has been randomized, his personal habits have been altered, Orta has the pills and no delivery opportunity. He eventually communicates through intermediaries that he cannot carry out the operation, and the CIA extracts him from Cuba. The agency orders more pills and begins identifying alternative delivery routes. The Cuban asset network the CIA builds to support assassination delivery operations is, by 1961, surprisingly extensive. The agency recruits from among the Cuban exile community in Miami, men who have family and professional connections inside Cuba, who can communicate with contacts still on the island, who have motivation to see the Castro government fall. The ideological coherence of these recruits varies enormously. Some are committed Democrats who genuinely believe a post-Castro Cuba would become a free society. Some are former Batista loyalists motivated by personal loss. Some are people for whom the operational work, the training, the money, the sense of belonging to a significant enterprise is the primary draw. Managing an asset network of this diversity, with the security vulnerabilities it creates, is a task that the CIA's Cuba desk handles with mixed results and, as later events will demonstrate, catastrophic lapses. This is the structure: American intelligence contracting murder through American organized crime, which routes it through Cuban assets who cannot reach the target, while the senior officers who design the program maintain records carefully sanitized of anything that would constitute direct evidence of CIA authorization. The Church Committee documents it across nearly 200 pages. Every person who authorized, managed, or participated in this arrangement on the American side retires, receives their pension, and dies having never been charged. Event 4, the poisoned cigar and the contaminated diving suit, 1960-1963. The Technical Services Division of the Central Intelligence Agency is, functionally, a government-funded laboratory dedicated to the problem of killing people in ways that cannot be traced back to the United States government. Sidney Gottlieb runs it. He is 42 years old in 1960, the son of Hungarian Jewish immigrants, a chemist by training who earned his doctorate from the California Institute of Technology and joined the CIA in 1951. He is a stammerer who has spent years working to control it. He dances. He raises goats. He is, by every external account, a man of unusual personal warmth and intellectual intensity. He is also the man who runs MKULTRA, the CIA's decade-long program of non-consensual human experimentation involving LSD, electroshock therapy, hypnosis, and sensory deprivation, conducted on American citizens, Canadian citizens, mental patients, prisoners, and unwitting civilians without their knowledge or consent. He runs MKULTRA and the Castro Assassination Device program simultaneously, under the same directorship, drawing on the same staff and resources. Between 1960 and 1965, Gottlieb's division devotes significant and documented resources specifically to the problem of Fidel Castro's death. The proposals that emerge, many of which receive internal review, operational authorization, and resource allocation before failing at the delivery stage, have acquired over the decades a patina of dark comedy that allows audiences to process them at a safe remove. The exploding seashell is absurd. The poisoned cigar is absurd. The contaminated diving suit is absurd. This framing is a trap. These are not the desperate improvisations of a panicked bureaucracy. They are formally reviewed, officially authorized proposals produced by a staff division of a government agency with a budget, a chain of command, a scientific credentialing structure, and signatures on every approval form. The poisoned cigar is real. It is not the same as the exploding cigar, which is a separate device. The poisoned cigar is a Cohiba-style cigar infused with a lethal concentration of botulinum toxin. The operational concept is clean. Castro's signature public affectation is his cigar, and he is known to accept cigars from visitors and associates. If an agent can substitute a toxin-loaded cigar into his regular supply, through a vendor, through a personal connection, through any point in the chain between manufacturer and Castro's hand, Castro administers the poison himself. The TSA manufactures the cigars. The Church Committee confirms both the manufacture and the delivery to Cuban asset networks. The cigars are never successfully routed to Castro. The contaminated diving suit is documented with granular specificity in the Church Committee's final report. James Donovan is an American lawyer, a former Nuremberg prosecutor who later negotiates the exchange of Soviet spy Rudolf Abel for U-2 pilot Francis Gary Powers, who in 1962 and 1963 is conducting diplomatic negotiations with the Cuban government for the release of the Bay of Pigs prisoners. The negotiations are real. Donovan is operating in a genuine diplomatic capacity. CIA officers approach him with a proposal. He should deliver a customized underwater diving suit as a personal gift to Fidel Castro. Castro is a known and enthusiastic scuba diver. This information is well established in both American and Cuban open-source records. Castro has dived publicly and has spoken about his enthusiasm for the sport. The CIA's plan is to contaminate the interior of the suit's breathing apparatus with Madra foot fungus, which produces a chronic lung condition, and to treat the suit's exterior fabric with a chemical compound designed to cause a persistent, disfiguring skin disease. The goal, to be precise, is not immediate assassination. It is incapacitation, degradation, and public diminishment. The CIA wants Castro to be visibly sick, physically deteriorating, publicly impaired in ways that undermine the image of vigorous revolutionary leadership that sustains his authority. They are trying to give a foreign head of state a skin disease. The operation is aborted before Donovan's delivery. The CIA case officer managing Donovan apparently concludes, and this conclusion is documented in the Church Committee record, that using a lawyer conducting quasi-diplomatic negotiations as the carrier of a biological weapon creates an exposure problem that outweighs the operation's value. A clean, uncontaminated suit is substituted for the prepared one before Donovan makes the delivery. Castro receives the clean suit. He dives in it. He is unharmed. Donovan completes the prisoner negotiations, and 1,100 Bay of Pigs captives are released in exchange for approximately $53 million in food and medicine. The range of formally considered proposals extends well beyond these two. The Church Committee testimony and the Inspector General's report together establish consideration of thallium salt application to Castro's shoes, designed to depilate his beard, LSD aerosol introduction into a Havana radio studio ventilation system before a broadcast, multiple poisoning schemes through food and drink, a sniper operation using a long-range shooter positioned along a known Castro route, and the hypodermic pen, a needle concealed in a ballpoint pen casing, manufactured by TSA and delivered operationally. The pen is the most consequential proposal because it is the only one that is not merely proposed but manufactured, authorized at the case officer level, and physically delivered to an asset for use. The asset is Rolando Cubella, a major in the Cuban Revolutionary Armed Forces who has been recruited as a CIA agent under the cryptonym AMLASH. The pen is delivered by Desmond Fitzgerald, the head of the CIA's Special Affairs Staff, in Paris on November 22, 1963. John F. Kennedy is killed in Dallas, Texas, at 12:30 in the afternoon on November 22, 1963. Fitzgerald is in a Paris hotel room delivering an assassination device to a Cuban asset at the moment his president is being murdered in a Texas street. He completes the delivery. He files his operational report. No one in the CIA chain of command apparently pauses to consider whether the timing is significant. The institutional momentum of the assassination program is so complete that it continues running on the same afternoon. The American government is thrown into crisis by what may be a retaliatory strike from the government they have been trying to kill. This is not a conspiracy. It is an institution that has lost its capacity for moral interruption. Sidney Gottlieb supervises the manufacturing of these devices, signs the authorization paperwork, and oversees the chain of custody from laboratory bench to field delivery for years. He retires in January 1973 and shreds the records before walking out. He is never charged with anything related to the Castro assassination program. Desmond Fitzgerald dies of a heart attack in 1967, the same year the CIA's internal review of his AMLASH operation is completed and classified. He is never charged. The TSA technicians who built the contaminated diving suit and loaded the botulinum cigars are never identified in any public record. They are not named in the Church Committee report. They retire on schedule at the appropriate grade with full benefits. The operational apparatus of an assassination program disperses back into civilian life, and no mechanism exists to follow it there. Event 5, Operation Mongoose, RFK TAKES Command, 1961-1962. The Bay of Pigs ends on April 19, 1961. The invasion that the CIA and the Kennedy administration have spent months planning is crushed in 72 hours. Approximately 1,100 CIA-trained Cuban exile fighters, Brigade 2506, land on the beaches of Bahia de Cachinos and are captured or killed. The air support that might have changed the outcome is not authorized. The operational planning that was supposed to protect the cover story exposes it within 24 hours. The invasion is a public failure of the most complete kind, visible to the entire world, denied by a cover story that collapses immediately, attributed to the United States before the week is out. Kennedy takes public responsibility at a press conference on April 21st. There's an old saying, he tells reporters, that victory has 100 fathers and defeat is an orphan. He means it as self-deprecation. He is also quietly furious. He fires CIA Director Alan Dulles, who retires with honors. He fires Richard Bissell. He considers briefly the complete dismantlement of the CIA and decides against it. He keeps the Cuba problem. The man he assigns to solve it is his brother Robert. Robert Kennedy is 35 years old in late 1961. He is the Attorney General of the United States, the chief law enforcement officer of the nation, the man responsible for the prosecution of organized crime in America. He is also, and primarily, his brother's most trusted advisor and the instrument of the Kennedy family's political will. The Bay of Pigs is not, for the Kennedys, merely a policy failure. It is a humiliation. It requires rectification. Robert Kennedy approaches the Cuba mandate with the specific intensity of a man who has something personal at stake, and the documents the Church Committee recovers from this period leave little room for ambiguity about the tone he sets. Operation Mongoose receives formal presidential authorization on November 30, 1961, via a National Security Action Memorandum signed by President Kennedy. It designates Brigadier General Edward Lansdale as operational director. Lansdale is a counterinsurgency theorist who has worked in the Philippines in the 1950s, advising on the government's successful campaign against the Huk insurgency, and who spent time in South Vietnam developing the American advisory mission there. He approaches the Cuba problem with the same intellectual confidence he brings to every counterinsurgency assignment: the belief that a sufficiently sophisticated combination of political, economic, psychological, and paramilitary pressure can, if correctly applied, bring down a government. His planning documents for Mongoose are remarkable artifacts. They read in places like management strategy documents, detailed timelines, measurable objectives, phased implementation plans, success metrics. They propose a 32-task operational program for the systematic destabilization and overthrow of the Cuban government. They set the objective of internal Cuban revolt by October 1962. This deadline, driven by the congressional midterm elections in November 1962, will shape every subsequent operational decision in ways that case officers later describe as fundamentally reckless, creating pressure to take operational risks that are justified by political calendar rather than operational logic. Mongoose reports to the Special Group Augmented, an NSC coordinating body whose membership includes Robert Kennedy, George Bundy, CIA Director John McCone, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs General Lyman Lemnitzer, Undersecretary of State U. Alexis Johnson, and Deputy Secretary of Defense Roswell Gilpatrick. The group meets regularly, receives operational briefings, and pushes for results. Robert Kennedy is, by the accounts of multiple participants whose testimonies the Church Committee records, the most consistently aggressive voice in these meetings, the person who most persistently demands faster action, more aggressive operations, and more risk tolerance from the CIA's operational staff. At its operational peak in 1962, Mongoose deploys over 400 CIA officers in Miami, operating out of the JM Wave Station, a classified facility on the South Campus of the University of Miami, operating under the commercial cover of Zenith Technical Enterprises, a supposed electronics company that employs several hundred people, owns a fleet of boats, and runs training operations out of properties scattered across South Florida. JM Wave is the largest CIA station in the world outside of Langley at this moment. Its annual budget is approximately $50 million. Its physical footprint includes warehouses, docks, aircraft hangars, and training camps. South Florida intelligence insiders and Cuban exile community members know roughly what Zenith Technical Enterprises actually is. Secrecy of this scale in a civilian environment is impossible, but the official cover holds because no one with institutional power challenges it. The assassination component of Mongoose runs through William Harvey, who is brought into the Mongoose structure from ZR Rifle. Harvey's relationship with Robert Kennedy is hostile from the beginning. Harvey writes internal memoranda, recovered and entered into the record by the Church Committee, describing Kennedy's direct involvement in operational planning as a security liability. He argues that a politician's need for operational detail creates exposure that professional intelligence officers are trained to avoid. The committee reads these memos as genuine security concerns. They may also be read as the documents of a man who does not want to be watched while he runs a murder program. The rupture between them comes in October 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis. As American and Soviet leadership negotiates the most dangerous standoff of the Cold War, Harvey, apparently concluding that military conflict is imminent and that covert sabotage operations should precede any military engagement, launches 4 six-man teams of Cuban agents into Cuba without authorization from the special group augmented from Kennedy or from anyone else in his operational chain of command. Robert Kennedy discovers the unauthorized launches. The confrontation between them is documented by multiple witnesses. Within weeks, Harvey is transferred off the Cuba desk and assigned to the CIA's station in Rome. He retires from the CIA in 1966. He dies in 1976 from heart failure. He is never charged with anything. Mongoose produces, by the CIA's internal count, over 50 documented sabotage operations against Cuban facilities between 1961 and 1963. It produces crop destruction operations. It produces propaganda campaigns and psychological operations. It produces the AMLASH recruitment. It produces the hypodermic pen. It does not produce the overthrow of the Cuban government. What it may produce, in part, is the Cuban Missile Crisis, because Soviet and Cuban awareness that the United States is running a sustained, large-scale campaign to destroy the Cuban government provides part of the strategic logic for placing Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, close enough to the American mainland to deter invasion. The missiles arrive in October 1962. Kennedy and Khrushchev spend 13 days bringing the world to the edge of nuclear war before pulling it back. The operation designed to overthrow a government nearly ends civilization. The Mongoose period also produces a generation of Cuban exile fighters whose training and operational experience create a specific problem for American law enforcement in the years that follow. The men trained by CIA contractors at facilities in South Florida and the Caribbean are skilled in small unit tactics, sabotage, and covert infiltration. When the Cuba program is wound down after the missile crisis, these men, trained killers with strong political motivations and no institutional home, circulate into various contexts. Some into the exile political organizations that continue operating in Miami, some into freelance operations, some into the organized crime networks that overlap with the CIA's Cuba infrastructure. The full accounting of where the Mongoose-trained operatives go and what they do is not part of any public record. It is a thread that the Church Committee pulls but does not fully unravel. Event 6, the Exploding Seashell and Other Technical Division Proposals, 1963. There is a hazard in describing what the Technical Services Division proposes for Castro that needs to be named directly before it becomes another object of disbelieving amusement. The CIA's exploding seashell, the poisoned cigars, the shoe-dusting scheme, the LSD ventilation operation, these sound at a certain distance like the exasperated improvisations of a government that knows it has failed and is grasping at anything. The comedy is in the incongruity, the most powerful intelligence service in the world, allegedly plotting to murder a man with a contaminated diving suit. The comedy invites dismissal, and dismissal is the trap. What these proposals actually document is not incompetence. Incompetence would be more comforting. What they document is a program in which the question, should we be doing this, has been entirely replaced by the question, how do we do this, and in which the answer to the second question is treated as a technical problem to be solved through the systematic application of scientific and logistical resources. The morality of the project is not under discussion. It was resolved administratively sometime in 1959 or 1960, and the files were stamped and the budget lines were opened. The exploding seashell appears in the CIA Inspector General's 1967 internal report. It is not a rumor or an embellishment. It is a government document recovered by the Church Committee and entered into the public record that describes a Technical Services Division proposal to construct an artificial seashell of unusual size and striking visual appearance, large enough and colorful enough to attract the attention of a curious diver, packed with a high explosive charge and fitted with a contact fuse. The shell is to be placed on the ocean floor at a depth and location where Castro is known to dive. When he approaches it or disturbs it, it detonates. This proposal is internally reviewed. It is formally considered. When Church Committee investigators ask CIA officials directly in 1975 about the seashell, the agency confirms it was genuine. The reason it is not executed is not ethical. The TSA assessment determines that the reliable placement of a specific object at a specific location correlated with an actual Castro dive, insufficient secrecy to avoid detection by Cuban security divers who routinely swept Castro's dive sites, is not operationally feasible with available assets. The idea is set aside on logistics. Consider the institutional process that produces this outcome. The CIA does not decline to build a bomb disguised as a seashell because building a bomb disguised as a seashell to kill a human being is morally wrong. The CIA declines because it cannot guarantee delivery. The moral question is not in the decision tree. Gottlieb's division is, in parallel with the Castro operations and the AMLASH device work, conducting MKULTRA experiments on human subjects who do not know they are being experimented on. The experiments include prolonged LSD dosing, electroshock administration, isolation, sleep deprivation, and various psychological pressure techniques. Some of the subjects sustain permanent psychological damage. At least one Frank Olson, a U.S. Army biochemist who is dosed with LSD without his knowledge in 1953 and dies 9 days later in a fall from a New York hotel window, almost certainly dies as a consequence of the experiment, though his death is recorded at the time as a suicide. His family receives compensation decades later, after the MKULTRA files that Gottlieb fails to fully destroy allow the Church Committee to reconstruct what happened to him. The Seashell program and the MKULTRA program share a director, a division, a budget source, and a moral framework, that the ends defeating communism, understanding the mind's susceptibility to control, justify the means. In both programs, human beings are treated as problems to be solved. In both programs, the solution is presented in administrative language that removes the human being from the moral accounting. Beyond the individual proposals, the TSA's operational output in this period also includes the development of broader sabotage and disruption capabilities for Cuba that run parallel to the Assassination program. The division produces remote-controlled demolition devices for industrial targets, develops defoliant compounds tested for use against Cuban sugarcane crops, and researches biological agents for potential introduction into Cuban food and water infrastructure. The biological contamination proposals receive review at the special group augmented level. At least one proposal, according to Church Committee supplementary materials, receives preliminary authorization before being aborted. These are not fringe ideas generated by one rogue scientist. They are reviewed by the senior interagency body that includes the Attorney General of the United States. The AMLASH device, the hypodermic pen, is delivered on November 22, 1963. This is also the day the CIA loses its president. No one in the agency's leadership apparently considers, in the hours and days that follow, whether the assassination program they have been running for 4 years might be causally connected to what has just happened in Dallas. If anyone does consider it, no document recording that consideration survives in anything the Church Committee recovers. Operational momentum is a specific kind of institutional amnesia. The program has a direction, it continues in that direction. The calendar changes around it. The specific question of what happens inside the CIA's Cuba operations leadership in the days and weeks following Kennedy's assassination is one that the surviving record addresses only partially. What the Church Committee establishes is that the AMLASH program continues running after November 1963. The new CIA director, John McCone, is briefed on AMLASH in general terms and does not shut it down. Desmond Fitzgerald continues managing it. There is no documented internal debate within the CIA about whether the assassination program they have been running might be causally related to what has just happened. If any officer raises this question in a meeting, no record of the meeting survives. The program continues because the institutional directive that created it has not been revoked, and the revocation of institutional directives requires someone with authority to decide that the directive was wrong. Nobody in the CIA's leadership in late 1963 decides that. Event 7, the Mafia Double Cross, How the Mob Used the CIA, 1960-1965. The CIA recruits organized crime to kill Fidel Castro. That is the headline. What the headline does not capture is that the relationship immediately develops dynamics the CIA does not control and does not fully understand, and that by 1962 at the latest, the men the CIA has recruited are using the relationship for purposes that have nothing to do with Cuba. Sam Giancana enters the CIA's operational structure in September 1960 while he is under active FBI surveillance. The Chicago field office of the FBI has been monitoring his communications and maintaining physical surveillance on his movements for years. After Giancana joins the CIA's program, the agency's Sheffield Edwards contacts the FBI to request a suspension of the electronic surveillance, citing an ongoing national security operation that the continued surveillance would potentially compromise. This request is documented in FBI records that the Church Committee recovers and enters into the public record. The Bureau suspends the surveillance on Giancana. The boss of the Chicago outfit receives partial protection from federal law enforcement as a direct, documented, administratively traceable consequence of his CIA relationship. The FBI that J. Edgar Hoover runs, the FBI that is supposed to be the primary mechanism for prosecuting organized crime in America, backs off Sam Giancana because the CIA asks it to. Hoover knows what is happening. He is briefed on the CIA-mob relationship, at least in outline, through the intelligence-sharing protocols between the two agencies. His response to this knowledge is not moral outrage. His response is to collect the information and hold it as leverage over the CIA, leverage over the Kennedys, leverage over whoever might someday need to be reminded of what he knows. This is how J. Edgar Hoover has always operated, and the CIA's recruitment of Giancana gives him a new piece for his collection. The second instance of organizational protection concerns a 1961 wiretapping incident in Las Vegas. Giancana is connected to an illegal electronic surveillance operation at the Riviera Hotel, a wiretap placed on an entertainer whom Giancana suspects of romantic interest in singer Phyllis McGuire, with whom Giancana has a relationship. Robert Maheu, the CIA's cutout, is implicated in the wiretap. The case develops enough for the Justice Department's Organized Crime Section, Robert Kennedy Section, to consider prosecution. The CIA intercedes. Agency officials communicate to Justice Department personnel that prosecution of Maheu would compromise a sensitive ongoing national security operation. The case is dropped. The Attorney General of the United States, who does not know about the CIA-mob assassination partnership, has his own Justice Department ordered to stand down from a mob-connected prosecution by an intelligence agency his administration nominally controls, without being told why. Kennedy is simultaneously overseeing the most aggressive anti-organized crime prosecution campaign in American history. His own department is providing cover for organized crime figures because the CIA has arranged it without his knowledge. The circularity is complete. Johnny Rosselli's exploitation of the CIA relationship is more subtle and more durable. Rosselli entered the United States illegally in the 1920s and has sustained his presence through corruption, connections, and the specific kind of practiced invisibility available to men who know where every body is buried, including their own. His immigration status is irregular. Deportation is a real and persistent legal vulnerability. Beginning in 1961, Rosselli begins using his CIA operational relationship as insurance against immigration enforcement. He communicates to CIA handlers, and these communications are documented in surveillance records and Church Committee testimony, that his continued cooperation with the assassination program is contingent on the CIA's willingness to run interference if immigration authorities move against him. The CIA pays this. The alternative is Rosselli's withdrawal from the program and potentially his decision to discuss what he knows with people who are not the CIA. This is extortion. It is conducted against the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States by a man the agency recruits as a murder contractor. The agency pays it. Santos Trafficante's role in the operation is, of the three primary mob figures, the most consequential and the most uncertain. Cuban intelligence records, portions of which become accessible to American researchers after Castro's death in November 2016, suggest the possibility that Trafficante was functioning simultaneously as a Cuban intelligence asset while operating as a CIA contractor. The operational logic is straightforward. The Cuban DGI has obvious and compelling motivation to penetrate the CIA's assassination program, and Trafficante's combination of Cuban connections, CIA access, and personal resentment toward Castro, real resentment, motivated by the loss of his Cuban business interests, makes him, from the DGI's perspective, a high-value potential asset. If Trafficante is a double agent, the CIA is paying a Cuban intelligence operative to fail to deliver its assassination contracts, while Havana reads every operational development. This cannot be established as documented fact in any publicly available record. What can be established is that every assassination operation running through the Trafficante channel fails. Every Cuban asset in the network who can be identified through the surviving record is identified and neutralized by Cuban state security. The CIA's own internal post-mortem, conducted after the Church Committee revelations, cannot definitively rule out penetration of the network as a cause of the operational failures. Johnny Rosselli is murdered on July 28, 1976. His body is discovered inside a 55-gallon steel oil drum that has been sealed and dumped in Dumfuddling Bay near Miami. He has recently provided testimony to the Senate Intelligence Committee about his CIA relationships. He is 71 years old. His murder is never solved. Sam Giancana is shot 7 times in the back of the head in the basement of his Oak Park, Illinois home on June 19, 1975. He has been formally subpoenaed to testify before the Church Committee. His testimony never occurs. His murder is never solved. The men who linked the American government to organized crime are killed before the accounting is complete. This is, in retrospect, the most efficient form of document destruction available. Event 8, the Warren Commission blackout, what HCLMS deliberately hid, 1964. John F. Kennedy is shot and killed on Elm Street in Dallas, Texas, at approximately 12:30 p.m. on November 22, 1963. He is 46 years old. He is the 35th President of the United States. He is assassinated 3 days after the CIA delivers an assassination device to a Cuban asset in Paris. President Lyndon Johnson creates the President's Commission on the Assassination of President Kennedy 3 days after the shooting, on November 29, 1963. It is chaired by Chief Justice Earl Warren and thereafter known as the Warren Commission. Its mandate is complete: to investigate all facts and circumstances relating to the assassination and to make available to President Johnson a full report, complete, all facts, all circumstances. The commission operates for 10 months. It interviews over 500 witnesses. It reviews more than 80,000 pages of investigative reports generated by the FBI, the Secret Service, Dallas law enforcement, and other agencies. It issues its final report in September 1964, a document of nearly 900 pages that concludes Lee Harvey Oswald, acting alone, killed President Kennedy. The report contains no mention of the CIA's active assassination program against Fidel Castro. To understand the significance of this omission, it helps to understand what the Warren Commission is working with and what it is not. The Commission has access to the FBI's full investigative file, 80,000 pages of witness interviews, physical evidence documentation, and background investigation on Lee Harvey Oswald. It has the Secret Service's protection records. It has Dallas law enforcement records. It has autopsy reports and ballistics analysis and the Zapruder film. It has, in other words, an enormous evidentiary base for establishing the physical facts of the assassination. What it does not have, because Helms and Dulles decide it should not have, is any information about the institutional context that might make the question of motivation and conspiracy legible. Oswald's pro-Castro activities, his Fair Play for Cuba committee leafleting in New Orleans, his contacts with Cuban exile figures and Soviet officials. All of this appears in the Commission's record without the analytical framework that the CIA's assassination program would have provided. The Commission cannot connect dots it does not know exist. It contains no mention of the CIA mob operational partnership. It does not explore whether a government the United States has been trying to kill for 4 years might have had motive and means to strike back. It does not examine the connections between Oswald, a man with a documented history in the Soviet Union, a Soviet wife, publicly visible pro-Cuba sympathies, and a prior residence in New Orleans where CIA-connected Cuban exile operations are active and the government Castro represents. The omission is deliberate. Richard Helms is the CIA's deputy director for plans in 1964. He has been fully briefed on ZR rifle since at least 1962. He knows about the botulinum pills, the mob contract, the AMLASH operation, the hypodermic pen delivered in Paris on the day of the assassination. He testifies before the Warren Commission. He says nothing about any of it. The decision to withhold this information is not made in a moment of individual moral failure by one officer acting alone. It is made in a documented process, documented because the CIA Inspector General's report describes it, in which Helms and Sheffield Edwards together determine that the Warren Commission does not need to know about the CIA's assassination plots against Castro. They make this determination themselves without consulting the Commission, without consulting President Johnson, who created the Commission, and without any legal authority to make it. The Commission's formal mandate requires complete disclosure of all relevant information. Helms and Edwards decide between themselves what is relevant. The Inspector General's report describes their reasoning. Disclosure would compromise ongoing operations and create political complications disproportionate to the investigative value. The committee that reviews this reasoning in 1975 finds it not credible on either ground. The Commission is chaired by the Chief Justice of the United States. Its members hold the highest security clearances available. Its mandate is specifically the investigation of a presidential assassination, and the existence of a CIA organized crime murder contract targeting a foreign leader who might have had retaliatory motive is, by any reasonable definition, relevant to that investigation. Alan Dulles sits on the Warren Commission. This fact deserves to be held in view for a moment without softening. Alan Dulles ran the CIA when ZR rifle was created. He is briefed on the assassination program's existence. He knows about the mob partnership. He knows about the botulinum pills. He becomes a member of the Commission investigating whether anyone with motive to retaliate against the American government might have killed its president. He participates actively in the Commission's work for 10 months. He says nothing about what he knows. What makes Dulles' participation particularly corrosive is not merely what he withholds but what he contributes. As a Commission member, Dulles helps frame the investigative questions, reviews staff findings, and participates in the Commission's deliberations about whether to pursue or narrow lines of inquiry. He brings to this role the accumulated knowledge of a man who ran the CIA for 8 years, who is personally familiar with both the assassination program and its potential relevance to Kennedy's death, and who is professionally committed to the CIA's institutional protection. His presence on the Commission is not neutral. He shapes its work while withholding the context that would most profoundly redirect that work. This is not passive concealment. It is active misdirection by the most credentialed intelligence professional on the Commission's membership. J. Edgar Hoover runs the FBI, which conducts the primary investigation that the Warren Commission relies on. Hoover knows about the CIA mob partnership from the intelligence-sharing briefings that Sheffield Edwards provides. Hoover also personally despises Robert Kennedy and has no incentive to help the Kennedy family understand what the CIA has been doing. His FBI's investigation is complete in its documentary volume and narrow in its analytical imagination. It establishes the physical facts of the shooting and does not pursue organizational connections with the thoroughness that the CIA's withheld information might have prompted. The Church Committee's assessment, published in its final report, is explicit and unambiguous. The CIA's deliberate concealment of the assassination program from the Warren Commission precluded the Commission from fulfilling its responsibility. What conclusions the Commission might have reached had it been given what Helms and Dulles withheld cannot be known. What is known is that the decision was made, and the Commission operated in the dark about the most relevant context available. Richard Helms is named CIA Director in June 1966. He serves until 1973. He is appointed ambassador to Iran and serves there through 1977. He is prosecuted in 1977 for lying to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee about Chile, not for anything related to Cuba, and receives a $2,000 fine and a suspended sentence. He calls the fine a badge of honor. He receives the National Security Medal in 1983. He publishes his memoir in 2003, the year after his death at 89. He is eulogized as one of the defining intelligence officers of the 20th century. He is never charged for what he did to the Warren Commission. The door is never held open long enough for accountability to walk through. Event 9, the document shredding, Gottlieb's destruction of ZR rifle records, 1970 to 1973. In January 1973, Sidney Gottlieb retires from the Central Intelligence Agency. Before he walks out, he destroys the files. This is not a figure of speech. Gottlieb and his team physically feed documents into shredding machines. The primary operational records of ZR rifle, case officer cables, asset payment records, operational timelines, delivery reports, communication logs between Harvey and Bissell and Edwards, the full documentation of every poison delivery and every failed attempt are converted to strips of paper and disposed of. The MKULTRA files are destroyed separately, in a different operation, shortly before Gottlieb's retirement. Both destruction events are authorized at the level of CIA Director. Helms approves the MKULTRA destruction directly. The ZR rifle destruction is reconstructed by the Church Committee through the survival of secondary documents, administrative cables about the destruction process that move through channels distinct from the operational files themselves. The timing is not incidental. By 1972, the Watergate scandal has demonstrated that congressional and prosecutorial interest in the Nixon administration's uses of government agencies for political purposes has teeth. The CIA is not directly implicated in Watergate at the senior levels, but the political atmosphere makes visible what has always been structurally true, that congressional oversight, when seriously pursued, is capable of accessing material the CIA has treated as permanently protected. Jack Anderson publishes his syndicated column in January 1971 describing the CIA mob connection in outline. The column produces a brief public sensation. Congressional interest flickers. Anderson's account is based on solid sources but lacks the documentary specificity that would make the story prosecutable or politically irreversible. The CIA internally identifies the security breach, determines the probable source, and accelerates its review of remaining sensitive records. The response to Anderson's column inside the CIA is documented in administrative communications that survive the shredding because they travel through channels the destruction operation misses. These communications discuss the need to review and sanitize the remaining ZR rifle documentation. They do not use the word destroy. They use sanitize. This is not accidental language. It is the careful diction of people who understand that the record of their decision to destroy records might itself become a record. Gottlieb testifies before the Church Committee in 1977, 4 years after his retirement. He is living on a farm in Virginia, tending goats and doing hospice volunteer work. These biographical details are consistently noted in accounts of him, and they consistently produce the same effect, the dissonance between the gentleness of the retirement and the institutional history it follows. Gottlieb acknowledges the document destruction to the committee. He acknowledges its scope. He states that the records no longer had operational value and that their destruction was consistent with standard agency records management procedure. He says this under oath. The statute of limitations on federal obstruction of justice charges runs 5 years. The document destruction takes place in 1972 and 1973. The Church Committee's investigation runs from 1975 to 1976. By the time the committee has built a sufficiently complete picture of what was destroyed and why, the window for criminal charges related to the destruction has closed. Whether this timing is the result of deliberate calculation or institutional luck is a question the surviving record does not answer. What the record does answer is the outcome. What survives and what makes the Church Committee's investigation possible is the 1967 Inspector General report written by J.S. Ehrman. Ehrman writes this report not for accountability, but for institutional liability management. The CIA's leadership, by 1967, is aware that enough people within the agency know enough about the assassination program that some form of internal accounting is prudent. The report is written to understand the exposure. It is classified immediately. It is withheld through 3 decades of oversight requests, congressional inquiries, and journalistic investigations. It is finally released through a Freedom of Information Act request in 1993, 26 years after it is written, and it becomes the primary evidentiary foundation for every serious historical account of the program. Ehrman writes it well. He writes it with enough specificity that even in the absence of the primary operational records that Gottlieb destroys, it is possible to reconstruct the architecture of the program, the identities of the key participants, the operational sequence of events, and the decision-making process that authorized each stage. Whether Ehrman intends his report to function this way, whether he writes it knowing it will eventually surface and that its specificity will be historically necessary, is unknowable. What is knowable is that his careful documentation is the reason we know as much as we know. The Family Jewels memo, which CIA Director James Schlesinger orders compiled in 1973 in response to early Watergate-era concerns, lists the MKULTRA experiments and the assassination planning in the same document. The memo is not intended for external consumption. It is an internal inventory of legally or politically sensitive activities, compiled so that CIA leadership knows what exposure the agency faces. When it becomes public, first through the Church Committee and later through subsequent FOIA releases, it functions as a self-indictment, the CIA's own list of the things it did that it knows it should not have done. The ZR rifle assassination program is on the list. The document destruction that removes the primary records of ZR rifle happens after the memo is compiled. The men who authorized the destruction know what is in the memo and know what the records they are destroying would show. They destroy the records anyway. Gottlieb dies on March 7, 1999, on his Virginia farm. He is 79 years old. He is survived by his wife, 4 children, and a legacy that includes the systematic destruction of evidence about 2 of the most serious programs in CIA history. His New York Times obituary describes him as the CIA scientist who supervised MKULTRA. It does not mention ZR rifle. These are not 2 different stories. They are the same story and the same man and the same moral failure, dressed in 2 sets of bureaucratic clothing. He is never charged with anything. Event 10, the Church Committee, the first time Congress learned what its government had done, 1975. It is January 1975. The Watergate scandal has destroyed the Nixon presidency, sent senior White House officials to prison, and produced a public reckoning about the relationship between executive power and democratic accountability that has not been experienced in the United States at this intensity since at least the McCarthy era. Seymour Hersh publishes a front-page New York Times story on December 22, 1974, reporting that the CIA has conducted a massive illegal domestic surveillance program against American anti-war activists and political dissidents, a program the CIA's own internal review, conducted under CIA Director James Schlesinger, refers to as the Family Jewels. The Family Jewels memo, circulated internally, also describes the assassination program. Hersh's story lands in a political environment already primed for institutional skepticism. Congress moves quickly. The Senate establishes the Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities in January 1975. It is chaired by Frank Church of Idaho. Church is 49 years old. He has served in the Senate since 1957, when he arrives as the youngest serving senator and becomes a member of the Foreign Relations Committee. He has been a consistent critic of executive overreach in foreign policy, a vocal opponent of the Vietnam War, a lead investigator of the ITT Chile scandal, a senator who has already tangled with the CIA over its role in Allen's overthrow. He understands, going into the investigation, that he is taking on something large. He does not know how large. The committee's legal infrastructure is built by Frederick A.O. Schwarz Jr., its chief counsel. Schwarz is a former litigator with Cravath, Swain, and Moore, one of the most rigorous corporate law firms in the country, and he approaches CIA witnesses with the methodical, document-dense examination style of a lawyer who has spent his career in complex litigation. His fundamental advantage over previous investigators is that he knows enough, from the family jewels memo and from the journalistic record and from preliminary staff research, to detect when witnesses are being evasive or internally inconsistent in ways that previous questioners, without this baseline knowledge, could not have caught. The committee has subpoena power. This changes everything. Prior congressional inquiries into CIA activities operated on the agency's goodwill. They asked for documents and testimony, and the agency decided what to provide. The Church Committee's subpoenas compel. The CIA can contest specific subpoenas on national security grounds and sometimes does, producing negotiated disclosures rather than complete ones. But the overall dynamic is reversed. The CIA must justify withholding rather than deciding what to share. For an institution that has operated for 28 years on the premise that it decides what Congress sees, this is a genuine structural challenge. The committee interviews over 800 individuals across 14 months of operation. It reviews over 50,000 documents. Among the witnesses, it calls for the Cuba assassination program. William Harvey, retired and visibly reluctant, who testifies about ZR rifle in enough operational detail that the committee can reconstruct the program's architecture despite the destruction of primary records. Sheffield Edwards, whose account of the CIA-mob relationship contains inconsistencies that the committee notes in its final report. Richard Helms, whose testimony about the Warren Commission concealment is reviewed by the committee and found not credible. Robert Maheu, who provides the most complete public account of the Fontainebleau Hotel meeting and the initial poison pill operation. James Angleton, the CIA's counterintelligence chief for 20 years, whose testimony is so labyrinthine and internally inconsistent that it dominates days of hearings and raises more questions than it answers. The committee's report on assassination plots against foreign leaders, Volume 5 of the 14-volume final output, is published in November 1975. It is 349 pages long. It documents 8 separate CIA-directed or CIA-supported plots against Castro between 1960 and 1965. It names the officers. It names the mob figures. It names the specific weapons. It establishes that multiple CIA directors were briefed on the program. It establishes that the program was deliberately concealed from the Warren Commission. It establishes that specific senior officers made specific documented decisions to withhold relevant information from a presidentially commissioned investigation into a presidential assassination. The committee recommends permanent intelligence oversight committees in both chambers of Congress. It recommends executive orders explicitly prohibiting assassination. It recommends clearer legal frameworks for covert operations. These recommendations produce the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, established in 1976, the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, established in 1977, and Executive Order 11,905, signed by Gerald Ford in February 1976, explicitly prohibiting American government employees from engaging in or conspiring to engage in political assassination. Frank Church runs for the 1976 Democratic presidential nomination. He enters the race late, wins 5 of the 6 primaries he contests, and cannot consolidate enough support before the convention. Jimmy Carter wins the nomination and the presidency. Church returns to the Senate. In 1980, conservative political organizations, some with documented connections to figures associated with intelligence community networks, target his Idaho re-election campaign with advertising describing him as a security threat. He loses his seat to Steve Sims by 4,000 votes, a margin of less than 1%. He dies of pancreatic cancer on April 7, 1984. He is 59 years old. The man who made the public record possible does not see its full consequences. The record outlasts him. The intelligence oversight committees that the Church Committee's recommendations produce, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, become permanent fixtures of the American national security architecture. They receive classified briefings. They review covert action programs. They provide a formal check on intelligence activities that did not exist before 1975. In the decades that follow their creation, they also become, critics argue, progressively more integrated into the intelligence culture they are supposed to oversee, more inclined to protect institutional secrets than to enforce institutional accountability. The Church Committee's most durable legacy may be the standard it sets rather than the structures it creates, the demonstration that determined congressional oversight with subpoena power and the will to use it can expose what intelligence agencies would rather keep buried. The standard exists. Whether subsequent committees choose to apply it is a separate question, answered differently in different eras. Event 11, Castro's own account, Declassified Cuban Intelligence Records, 1975-2016. Fidel Castro knows more about the CIA's attempts to kill him than any American institution has ever officially disclosed. This is not a claim he makes in passing. Beginning with his response to the Church Committee's November 1975 report, Castro discusses specific assassination attempts in operational detail that matches, and in several cases exceeds, the specificity of the committee's findings, demonstrating clearly that the Cuban government has maintained its own comprehensive record of what was attempted. The Cuban counterintelligence capability that produces this record is built by Fabian Escalante Font, who joins Cuba's security apparatus in the early 1960s as a young officer, and eventually rises to lead the DGI's department responsible for counterintelligence against CIA operations. Escalante is, in the structural sense, Castro's Frank Church, the internal investigator who builds the institutional accounting of what was done against his government, who maintains the record through the decades when American officials are still lying about it, and who eventually makes enough of that record public to allow a full comparison between what the CIA says happened and what actually happened. Escalante's documented count is 634 attempts over the span of Castro's rule. This is the number that produces the 600-plus figure at the opening of this video, not 634 sophisticated, operationally mature attempts to kill Fidel Castro. 634 plots of varying sophistication, organizational origin, and proximity to execution, ranging from direct CIA programs like ZR Rifle to independent Cuban exile operations, mafia-linked contracts, and hybrid arrangements involving multiple actors. Escalante categorizes these by period, method, and organizational origin. He publishes his accounting in multiple books, including The Secret War, CIA Covert Operations Against Cuba, which draws on partially declassified DGI records and which American and European scholars of CIA history cite as a primary source. The most operationally significant finding in the Cuban intelligence record concerns the AMLASH operation in Rolando Cubela. Cuban intelligence records, as described by Escalante and consistent with what is traceable through the declassified American record, indicate that the DGI identified Cubela as a CIA asset by 1963, before the November 1963 Paris meeting, at which Desmond Fitzgerald delivers the hypodermic pen. If this is accurate and the weight of available evidence supports it, then the CIA delivers an assassination device to a man whose identity as a CIA asset has already been established by Cuban state security. Castro is not at risk from Cubela. The DGI is observing the CIA deliver a weapon to a compromised asset, reading every operational development as it occurs. The implications extend beyond the AMLASH case. If Cuban counterintelligence penetrated the CIA's Cuba assassination program as thoroughly as the operational failure rate suggests, then the CIA was not simply failing to kill Fidel Castro. It was conducting assassination operations under Cuban surveillance, allowing Havana to identify and neutralize CIA assets in Cuba, and potentially providing Cuban intelligence with a detailed map of CIA operational methods, cover mechanisms, and asset networks. The program does not merely fail. In its failure, it may actively harm American intelligence capabilities across a broader range of Cuban operations. Castro's public discussions of the assassination attempts become, across the decades, a kind of running commentary on the CIA's operational competence. He discusses the exploding cigars with evident satisfaction. He describes the diving operations with the specificity of a man reading from a file. In a 2006 interview with journalist Ignacio Ramonet, published as the book My Life, Castro recounts specific operational details, delivery mechanisms, asset identities, timing of attempts that track closely against the Church Committee record and in some cases go beyond it. Ramonet's account of this interview was compiled over more than 100 hours of conversation. Castro's memory of specific operational details, decades after the events, is remarkable and is not, given the DGI's archival record, surprising. After Castro's death in November 2016, portions of Cuban state security archives become accessible to American and international researchers in ways that were not possible while he was alive. The picture that emerges from this material is one of a DGI that maintains extraordinarily detailed records of CIA operational activity, records that in some cases document CIA attempts before they materialize operationally, suggesting penetration sources within the CIA itself or within its Cuban asset networks that allow Havana to track CIA planning in near real time. The identity of any such penetration source, if one exists in the public record, has not been confirmed. Fidel Castro dies on November 25, 2016. He is 90 years old. The CIA begins its documented effort to kill him in December 1959. He outlives J.C. King, who writes the elimination memo. He outlives Alan Dulles, who receives it. He outlives Richard Bissell, William Harvey, Sheffield Edwards, and Desmond Fitzgerald. He outlives Sam Giancana and Johnny Rosselli, though their deaths precede his by 4 decades, and under circumstances that prevent them from outliving him in any practical sense. He outlives Richard Helms and Sidney Gottlieb. He outlives the political careers of most of the senators who investigate the program. The partial opening of Cuban state archives after 2016 also surfaces, for the first time in accessible form, the DGI's internal terminology for the CIA's assassination program. Cuban intelligence officers refer to the American effort as Plan Judas in some internal documents, a name that reflects the DGI's assessment of the CIA's use of Cuban nationals as delivery agents against their own government. The name captures something that the American bureaucratic language does not, the moral dimension of using a community's own members against it. The CIA's language is operational. The Cuban intelligence language is, in this respect, more honest about what the operation requires of the people recruited to carry it out. He is survived by his government, by the institutional record of what was attempted against it, and by the question that the Church Committee raises and does not fully answer. What does it mean for a democracy that the most powerful government in the world spends a decade trying to kill one man, hides the program from its own investigating bodies, destroys the records to prevent accountability, and faces no legal consequences for any of it? Castro's death does not answer the question. It only removes the man who was living proof that the program failed. Event 12, The Legal Fallout, Why Nobody Ever Went to Prison, 1975-present. The Church Committee's final report is published in November 1975. Volume 5 on assassination plots is 349 pages long and names names. It presents evidence. It describes crimes, the deliberate concealment of an assassination program from a presidential commission, the destruction of government records in anticipation of congressional inquiry, the use of organized crime as government contractors for murder, the operation of a sustained assassination program against a foreign head of state in violation of international law, and the systematic deception of multiple congressional oversight bodies over a 15-year period. The investigators have done work that is, by any standard, rigorous and historically important. Nobody goes to prison. Let that be stated without hedging and without apology. Nobody goes to prison. Nobody is prosecuted. Nobody is fined a meaningful amount. the most thoroughly documented assassination program in American intelligence history, operated by the most powerful government in the world against a foreign leader who is alive and willing to discuss it, produces a $2,000 fine for a different crime paid by one man who calls it a badge of honor. The first reason is the document destruction. Gottlieb and his team, with Helms's authorization, destroy the primary operational records of ZR rifle and MKULTRA in 1972 and 1973, after Jack Anderson's column has already alerted the CIA that public exposure is possible, after Watergate has demonstrated that congressional subpoena power can reach executive branch agencies. This is not records management. By any reasonable reading of relevant federal statutes, it is obstruction of justice. The statute of limitations on federal obstruction runs 5 years. The destruction occurs between 1972 and 1973. By the time the Church Committee completes its work in late 1975, the window for charging Gottlieb and Helms specifically for the document destruction has run. The timing of the destruction and the timing of the investigation are, at a minimum, operationally convenient for the men who ordered the shredding. The second reason is structural, the doctrine of presidential authorization. The CIA conducts its covert operations in the name of the executive branch and under the authority, direct or constructively implied, of the President of the United States. Prosecuting CIA officers for actions taken under presidential sanction raises the question of whether the president who gave that sanction bears criminal liability. Every administration from Eisenhower through Ford has participated at some level in the authorization structure that makes ZR rifle possible. The Ford administration, simultaneously issuing the executive order prohibiting assassination and negotiating with the Church Committee over document access, has a direct political interest in ensuring that the investigation resolves through legislative reform rather than criminal prosecution. The executive order is the trade. Congress gets the prohibition on future assassination in exchange for agreeing not to pursue criminal accountability for past assassination. This is a deal. It is made not through explicit negotiation, but through the institutional mutual understanding of people who live in the same political system and understand how it absorbs accountability. The third reason is Richard Helms in particular. Helms is the most legally exposed senior officer in the entire span of the Cuba program. He makes the Warren Commission concealment decision. He authorizes the document destruction. He lies in multiple congressional proceedings about the existence and scope of assassination programs. When he is finally prosecuted in 1977, it is for none of these things. He is prosecuted for perjury before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in 1973 for lying about CIA involvement in the overthrow of Salvador Allende in Chile. He pleads nolo contendere to 2 misdemeanor counts. The charge is not perjury, it is the lesser offense of failure to fully inform Congress. He receives a $2,000 fine and a 2-year suspended sentence with no imprisonment. He calls the fine a badge of honor at a press conference attended by former CIA officers who give him a standing ovation. He means it. He accepts the conviction as the cost of having kept the agency's institutional secrets, a framing the United States government effectively endorses by declining to prosecute the larger crimes. Helms receives the CIA's National Security Medal in 1983 at a ceremony at Langley attended by CIA Director William Casey. He publishes a memoir posthumously in 2003. He lives to age 89 and dies with his reputation, within intelligence community circles, substantially intact. Richard Bissell, who authorizes ZR rifle and the CIA-MOB partnership, retires with the National Intelligence Medal in 1962 and dies in 1994. Not charged. William Harvey, who runs ZR rifle, launches unauthorized sabotage operations during the Cuban Missile Crisis and retires in 1966. Not charged. Sheffield Edwards, who manages the CIA-MOB operational relationship and makes the Warren Commission concealment decision with Helms, retires in 1963 and dies in 1975. Not charged. Desmond Fitzgerald, who delivers the hypodermic pen on the afternoon of Kennedy's assassination and falsely claims to represent Robert Kennedy, retires in 1967 and dies of a heart attack the same year while playing tennis. not charged. Santos Trafficante Jr. continues operating as a criminal enterprise into the 1980s. He dies of complications following cardiac surgery in March 1987 at age 72. The CIA operations are never part of any prosecution brought against him. Executive Order 11905 prohibits American government employees from engaging in political assassination. Executive Order 12333, Reagan's 1981 revision, preserves the prohibition. It has never produced a prosecution. Its practical scope has been interpreted by subsequent administrations in ways that effectively suspend it for specific operational contexts that bear family resemblance to the logic that generated ZR rifle in the first place. The prohibition exists in law. The enforcement mechanism exists only if a political consensus forms around the idea that it should be used. That consensus has not formed. The legal architecture that makes accountability impossible is not an accident of timing or a failure of will by specific prosecutors. It is the systemic product of a government that designs its most sensitive operations to be unaccountable from the beginning, through plausible deniability, through document destruction, through the statute of limitations, through the doctrine of executive authorization, and that, when the operations are exposed, treats the exposure as a public relations problem rather than a legal one. The $2,000 fine is not the floor of accountability, it is the ceiling, and everyone who was there understood it. There is one additional fact about the legal outcome that deserves to be stated plainly, because it is the sharpest measure of what accountability actually means in this context. The Inspector General's 1967 report, the document that serves as the evidentiary backbone of the Church Committee's findings, is written by a CIA officer for CIA leadership to manage the agency's legal exposure. It is not written for Congress. It is not written for the public. It is written because the agency's leadership decides it needs an internal accounting before external exposure forces a less controlled one. The document is classified for 26 years. When it is finally released in 1993, it is because a Freedom of Information Act requester pursues it through the courts. The agency resists. The document is released only under legal compulsion. The institution that creates the document to protect itself fights for 26 years to keep the protection in place. This is the final statement of the program's accountability. A government that writes its own history of its own crimes, classifies that history to prevent public knowledge, litigates the release for 26 years, and when the release finally happens, faces no legal consequences from what the document reveals. The accountability is not deferred. It is designed out of the system from the beginning. The door closes without drama. No verdict, no sentence worth the name, just the sound of a government confirming what it has always known about itself, that the rule of law is what it says it is, and what it says is something different for different kinds of people. What you have just spent an hour with is not a collection of historical anomalies. It is not a sequence of rogue officers who exceeded their authority before a well-functioning system caught them and corrected course. There is no corrected course in this story. There is investigation, and there is record, and there is a $2,000 fine, and then there are medals and memoirs and retirements in Virginia. The assassination program against Fidel Castro runs for at least 5 years under formal CIA operational management, with the knowledge of CIA directors and the implicit authorization of 2 presidents, with the organized crime infrastructure of the United States contracted as a proxy for state violence, and with the full apparatus of institutional protection, plausible deniability, document destruction, coordinated lying, deployed on behalf of the men who ran it. When the risk of exposure arrives, the documents go into shredders. When the investigation comes, the witnesses tell incomplete stories. When the conviction finally lands, it is for the wrong crime, and it produces a fine that functions as institutional endorsement. The people who made the record visible deserve to be named. Frank Church, the Idaho senator who chaired the committee and paid for it with his Senate seat in the 1980 election. Frederick A.O. Schwarz Jr., whose legal precision gives the committee's findings their evidentiary durability, and whose subsequent work on intelligence oversight continues the institutional project the committee begins. Jack Anderson, the journalist who publishes the outline of the mob-CIA connection 3 years before the committee's subpoenas compel full disclosure, who puts it into print when it is still officially deniable and takes the professional risks that entails. The CIA officers whose sealed testimonies the committee agrees to protect, whose sense of institutional wrong proves more durable than their institutional loyalty. They are the reason the committee's investigators know what questions to ask. Fabian Escalante and the Cuban counterintelligence officers who document each attempt deserve to be named. They maintain, with the meticulous commitment of a state that understands its own survival depends on institutional memory, the most complete accounting of the program that exists from any single source. Without their work, the full scope of what was attempted would be significantly more obscured than it is. The question of why this matters in the present tense, why a program that ends in the mid-1960s and was exposed in 1975 is worth an hour of attention now, has a straightforward answer. The legal frameworks that make ZR rifle possible are not historical artifacts. The National Security Act, the Covert Action Authorization Process, the doctrine of executive privilege over intelligence activities, the classification system that keeps relevant documents from public view for decades, these are operating features of the current government. The intelligence committees created by the Church Committee's recommendations continue to receive classified briefings that the public never sees. The executive order prohibiting assassination has been interpreted and reinterpreted by successive administrations. The question of what a democratic government is permitted to do in secret, to whom, and with what accountability is not settled. The Church Committee's answer that the answer should be, not this and with full accountability, was the right answer in 1975, and it is the right answer now. There are still classified documents. The full AMLASH operational file is partially classified. JM wave station cables from the Mongoose period remain partially redacted in JFK Assassination Records Act releases. The question of DGI penetration of CIA Cuba operations, the question of whether Trafficante or some other asset within the program was reporting to Havana, remains unanswered in the public record. The complete picture has not been assembled, because the people with the authority to complete it have decided, repeatedly, that the public interest in knowing does not outweigh the institutional interest in not telling. What has been established is enough to name the program and its architects, enough to document the cover-up and the men who executed it, enough to count the people who faced no consequences and record what those consequences were not. Sitting with this material is hard, not because it is distant history, it is not distant. The institutional frameworks that made ZR rifle possible are not museum exhibits. The doctrine of plausible deniability is operating. The practice of concealing covert operations from congressional oversight is operating. The use of criminal networks as proxies for state violence is a subject of active public debate in the present tense. The question the Church Committee raises, whether a government can authorize murder and remain a government of laws, is not a question that was asked and answered in 1975. It is a question that is still being asked in different language about different operations in every generation that inherits this government. You have sat with that question for the length of this video. That is not nothing. History is not what happened. History is what we choose to remember, to teach, and to demand accountability for. The rest is what powerful people hope you forget. Don't forget. If this video reached you, share it, subscribe, leave a comment with the event that hit you hardest. Come back for the next one, because there are more.